The courtyard stank of wet straw as drums thudded against the dawn fog. The narrator watched Thomas Hale steady his breath while chains scraped stone near the scaffold. King Aldric Rowan said, "Do your duty, Captain." Thomas said, "I am a sergeant, Your Majesty." The correction trembled like a leaf. Lord Marcus Vale smiled thinly beside the throne chair. The smile promised favors and knives. Mingatshu. Lily Hart clutched a shutter in the gallery and tried not to gasp. Edwin Cross tightened the prisoner's bonds and would not meet Thomas's eyes. Selene Ward watched from a shadowed arch where the torch gutters hissed. The prisoner whispered, "Tell them the king knows my name." Thomas said, "I will not hear you." Rain ticked on helmets and turned dust to paste. Marcus said, "Mercy is treason when war drums sound." Aldric said, "End this." The axe waited like a verdict. Thunder rolled over the keep as banners snapped in the wind. Thomas lifted the blade and felt history leaning on his wrists. He saw the truth in the prisoner's stare. He swung and shattered the morning. The narrator followed Thomas as he rinsed the axe in the cistern and watched rust swirl like blood. Thomas said, "I did what law demanded." The words died against wet stone. Edwin Cross said, "Orders were clear, yet his eyes slid away." Marcus Vale glided into the passage with a smile that did not warm. Marcus said, "You served the crown well." The praise carried hooks. Thomas said, "What did he mean about the king knowing his name?" Marcus said, "Dying men babble to buy breath." The corridor smelled of old lime and smoke. Lily Hart hurried past with a basin and faltered when she saw Thomas. Lily said, "Sir, the bell keeps tolling." The bell beat like a wound. Selene Ward stepped from shadow and watched without greeting. Rain tapped through a broken pane and left silver chains on the floor. Thomas said, "If there is war, the truth will not sleep." Echoes nodded from the arch. A patrol clattered by with wet boots and cold eyes. Marcus said, "Truth is a servant when victory pays." The passage swallowed their steps. The narrator brought us to the king's council where maps bled ink across a scarred table. King Aldric Rowan said, "Border riders burn our wheat." Marcus said, "Then seize the granaries before panic breeds rebels." Thomas stood silent and listened to the rain gnaw the eaves. Edwin Cross said, "The garrison is thin since the levy marched." Aldric said, "We hold with fear or we fall with pity." The fire spat and threw sparks at old banners. Thomas said, "Mercy keeps men loyal when fear rots." Marcus said, "Mercy makes widows." Lily Hart slipped by with logs and froze at the threshold. She heard talk of quotas and chains. Selene Ward lingered near a lattice, studying each mouth more than each word. A messenger burst in with a sealed letter scraped by muddy fingers. The wax bore a broken stag. Aldric said, "Read." The letter whispered of raiders, led by a man who wore the king's signet. Thomas said, "That cannot be." Marcus said, "Masks fit many faces." Thunder shook loose dust from carved crowns. The narrator traced the seal to a dim records room, where dust lay like frost. Thomas said, "The signet was lost years ago." Edwin Cross said, "Lost or hidden." Shelves creaked with rolls bound in cracked twine. Lily Hart held a candle and kept close. The flame trembled in draughts that smelled of parchment and tallow. Selene Ward said, "Names vanish when kings pay for silence." Thomas said, "Who paid for this silence?" A mouse skittered and set scrolls whispering. Marcus Vale arrived with a key and an easy laugh. Marcus said, "Allow me." He opened a chest lined with black felt. The mold stain shaped a ring that was gone. Thomas said, "This room locked under your seal." Marcus said, "So we share a thief." The candle guttered and smoke bit their eyes. Aldric's footfalls sounded beyond, slow and heavy. Aldric said, "I will have that ring before sundown." The word sundown cut cold. Rain resumed its hiss against the slit. Lily's candle found a ledger with a torn page and a smear like dried rust. The narrator set the stage in the chapel where rain ticked on leaded glass and incense clung to stone. Thomas knelt and cleaned the axe with linen that once dressed a wound. Thomas said, "If I am to bear this, let it be for truth." Selene Ward said, "Truth stings worse than steel." Her voice folded into candle smoke. Lily Hart said, "The bell has not stopped." The bell tolled like a heartbeat too fast to heal. Edwin Cross entered and shut the door against the wind. Edwin said, "There is talk the prisoner named you before he died." Thomas said, "He named the king." Edwin said, "Rumor is a mill that eats names for grain." The glass flickered with lightning and painted their faces blue. Marcus Vale stepped from a pew shadow and smiled like a seal on a bargain. Marcus said, "Sundown nears." Thomas said, "Then the ring is closer than we think." A gust took the candles to thin threads. Aldric's guards passed outside with boots like hammers. The axe cloth darkened, as if the metal drank the storm. The narrator followed Thomas Hale through the armory where wet leather steamed and steel smelled like rain. He paused by a dented helm, tracing a gouge he could not place. Thomas said, "I can feel the cut, but not the battle." Lily Hart slipped in with a towel and a candle stub. Lily said, "The bell stopped, but whispers did not." Edwin Cross leaned on a rack and weighed silence. Edwin said, "The prisoner's last words will grow teeth." Thomas felt the keep pressed down like a millstone. He thought of fields he had never plowed. He thought of a father's voice he could not remember. Lord Marcus Vale arrived light as perfume. Marcus said, "Storms clear the air for decisive men." Thomas said, "Storms drown the careful and the cruel together." The torch hissed as a drop fell. Selene Ward stood at the threshold and measured every face. "Selene," said, "a signet rides tonight, not on a finger but in a pocket." The words hooked his breath and held it. Far off, hooves rang like coins on stone. The narrator set Thomas on the battlements where clouds dragged their bellies over chimneys. He watched smoke thread from poor roofs and felt the city breathing thin. Lily Hart said, "They say the raiders speak our prayers backward." Thomas said, "Fear has a gift for poetry." Edwin Cross joined with a wineskin he did not drink. Edwin said, "A name is moving through taverns, and it is yours." Thomas said, "Let it move until it tires." Lord Marcus Vale arrived with a scribe and a list for grain. Marcus said, "Close the granaries and feed only the paid." Thomas said, "Hunger fights for whoever opens a door." The scribe scratched like a rat in straw. Selene Ward watched the street below, where a boy ran with a wooden stag. Selene said, "Symbols breed faster than truth." Bells at the north gate chimed a wrong note. Thomas felt the note vibrate his ribs. He said, "If the signet is false, it still commands." The wind flipped the list and showed a blank that felt like a threat. The narrator entered the royal solar where coals glowed like eyes in a grate. King Aldric Rowan stood by a window stained with old victories. Aldric said, "A man wearing my past plunders my present." Thomas said, "The letter named your ring and your sign." Aldric did not turn. Aldric said, "There was a winter when I was not a king." The words limped and would not sit. Marcus Vale said, "Majesty, confession belongs to priests and to enemies." Thomas said, "Truth belongs to those who bleed for it." Edwin Cross kept to the tapestry where hounds chased forever. Selene Ward tracked the pulse in Aldric's jaw. Lily Hart brought mulled wine and trembled at the smell of cloves. Aldric said, "If I face this ghost, I must keep the crowd from seeing its face." Thomas said, "Crowds see in pieces and make holes you never meant." The window rattled with distant thunder. Aldric said, "Find the ring by dawn." The coal sighed and went dark. The narrator followed grain carts to the southern square where guards pinned back the crowd with halberds. Marcus Vale said, "Order first, then mercy." His voice climbed the statue like ivy. Thomas Hale walked the line and counted ribs he wished were numbers. Lily Hart said, "They will break if you pull tighter." Edwin Cross said, "They will riot if you loosen now." A woman shoved a child forward with a ticket that smelled of smoke. Thomas said, "Open a side gate and weigh by family, not coin." Marcus said, "You speak like a priest on borrowed bread." Selene Ward nodded to a shutter where a candle blinked twice. Selene said, "Your signet is near enough to smell." The shutter breathed and stilled. A stone skipped across the cobbles and broke the quiet. Thomas said, "Hold your ranks but lower your points." The guards hesitated and obeyed. Marcus smiled for the scribe and not the people. The sacks moved, and the square exhaled like a bellows that feared its own fire. The narrator slipped into the tannery lane where smoke from vats ate the air. Selene Ward said, "The ring was seen on a cord, not a hand." She led Thomas Hale past hides that dripped like winter. Thomas said, "Who wears a crown around the neck?" Selene said, "A man who steals a throne he cannot sit." Edwin Cross kept rear watch and counted doorways. Lily Hart carried chalk and marked turns for a path back. At a shed with a stag carved crude, Selene pressed her palm to the wood. The hinge groaned like an old oath. Inside, maps lay with corners burned. Thomas said, "Someone practiced disaster." A foot brushed ash and found a brass stamp for sealing wax. Marcus Vale arrived with a breathless guard who looked too eager. Marcus said, "We are fortunate guides." Thomas said, "Or led." The guard whistled once. Feet gathered like rain around the shed. Selene said, "We leave with proof or we do not leave." The door's shadow grew teeth. The narrator held us in the tannery shed as feet swarmed like rain on tin. Selene Ward said, "Smoke the exit, and they will choke on haste." Thomas Hale kicked ash across the maps and found a hatch rim. Edwin Cross said, "They boxed us for display, not death." Lily Hart chalked the brass stamp and tucked it under her apron hem. Lord Marcus Vale said, "We should parley before swords turn clumsy." Thomas said, "You arrived with a net, and call it courtesy." A beam groaned as hooks bit the door. Selene said, "Down." They dropped into a culvert where tannin water stung their eyes. Edwin said, "Left for the river grates." Lily said, "I marked the turns." Behind them, the eager guard shouted counts that felt like bids. Thomas said, "Proof first, pride later." The culvert coughed them into night where fog blurred the city into guesses. The narrator gathered crowds beneath the south gate where rumor outshouted bells. Thomas Hale said, "Open narrow and fast. Keep the line breathing." Edwin Cross said, "Your name is in a dozen mouths with 12 crimes." Lily Hart whispered, "They claim you wore the ring at the scaffold." Thomas said, "The dead do not lend jewelry." Lord Marcus Vale climbed a wagon and raised his hands like a priest. Marcus said, "The crown feeds the faithful and punishes thieves." Stones tapped the wood like timid knuckles. Selene Ward watched a shutter blink a coded 3. Selene said, "Messengers are buying fear with stag coins." A boy lifted a wooden stag and shouted for bread. Thomas said, "Grain to families by count, not coin." Murmurs bent toward sense, then snapped back. The sky pressed low and iron. The narrator shadowed Selene into the weaver's row, where looms slept like tired horses. Selene Ward said, "The courier meets by the dye vats at second bell." Thomas Hale said, "We take him quiet and keep the whisper alive." Edwin Cross tucked his badge under his collar and softened his step. Lily Hart said, "If he bolts, I will close the alley with a pail and a scream." The vats exhaled indigo that turned breath blue. A man in a hood weighed a corded ring against a lantern. Thomas said, "That ring buys only questions." The man ran and hit Lily's pail with a crash that burst color like a bruise. Selene moved first and cut the cord, sending metal skittering. "I'll," Edwin said, "hold him for the king's sight." The man laughed and bit a capsule that foamed black. Thomas said, "He dies to keep a lie clean." The bell tolled twice over wet stone. The narrator rode with Thomas to the North Farms where smoke smeared the hills. A barn burned like a held breath. Edwin Cross said, "Tracks split toward the mill and the ford." Thomas Hale said, "The mill gives echo, the ford gives speed." Lily Hart found a stag sigil stamped in wet clay by a boot heel. Selene Ward said they seed symbols and harvest panic. Arrows rasped past and buried in a cart bed. Thomas said, "Shields high and move slow." A raider broke from brush with the stag cord swinging at his neck. Thomas met him with the flat, and the mud took them both. Edwin said, "Alive if you can." The raider spat, "The king wears two faces." Thomas said names. The man grinned through blood and bit at his tongue. Selene bound his jaw with a strip before secrets bled away. The barn collapsed and threw sparks that chose the sky. The narrator returned to the solar where rain wrote slant lines on the glass. King Aldric Rowan weighed the cut cord and the stained ring on his palm. Aldric said, "I know this metal better than I know my sleep." Thomas Hale said, "Men die to keep it moving." Lord Marcus Vale said, "Plots dress in royal colors to gain doors." Selene Ward said, "The courtier chewed poison and smiled." Edwin Cross set down a ledger page that matched the tannery maps. Edwin said, "Roots mirror tax roads you sealed last winter." Marcus said, "Then thieves learn to read." Lily Hart stood small and did not blink. Lily said, "A guard counted us like coins outside the shed." Aldric's jaw worked like a hinge that missed oil. Aldric said, "If my past walks, I will name it before it names me." Thunder rolled a verdict he did not speak. The narrator set the court in a fever where accusations moved faster than ink. Thomas Hale said, "Name the charge before you weigh the rope." Lord Marcus Vale said, "Conspiracy with raiders and treasonous restraint." Edwin Cross stood straight and read a confession no mouth had spoken. Selene Ward said, "The handwriting belongs to a clerk who drowned last spring." The gallery rustled like wheat before a storm. Lily Hart stared at the wax stamp that matched the brass they found. Thomas said, "You forged a path and now drag me along it." Marcus said, "Paths reveal the feet that fit." King Aldric Rowan watched without blinking, as if stillness could halt fire. Thomas felt the hall shrink to the size of his breath. He said, "Let me face the accusers without masks." A hooded witness stepped forward and smelled of tan and smoke. Selene said, "Pull the hood and end the theater." The hood stayed, and the hall swallowed the dare. The narrator followed Selene to the scribe vault where charcoal smudged the dead clerk's ledgers. Selene Ward said, "He copied orders twice, one for law and one for fear." Thomas Hale said, "Fear's copy moves faster." Lily Hart found a page with grain roots that bent toward raider paths. Edwin Cross said, "Roots shifted after the levy, that is all." Selene tapped the margin and raised a brow at a sigil, shaped like a stag's broken tine. Thomas said, "Someone learned to write in the king's shadow." Marcus Vale appeared in the doorway like a verdict. Marcus said, "Scribes die of drink and of debts." The room answered with dust that glittered in a shaft of cold light. Thomas said, "Who pays for two copies?" Selene said, "The one who needs two faces." The corridor outside breathed boots that did not pass. The narrator brought them to the mill where river wheels beat like slow hearts. Men in cloaks traded sacks beneath dripping rafters. Selene Ward said, "Watch hands, not mouths." Thomas Hale said, "Take the buyer, not the mule." Edwin Cross circled and caught a glimpse of the eager guard from the shed. Lily Hart whispered, "He counts again." The guard palmed stag coins and passed a cord with a rings ghost stamped in wax. Thomas said, "You weigh people like grain." The guard ran for the catwalk. Selene cut him off with 3 steps and a look that ended arguments. Edwin said, "Name your master and drink air tonight." The guards smirked toward the city and said nothing. Marcus Vale arrived with soldiers whose boots were too clean for mills. Marcus said, "You intervene where trade keeps bellies full." Thomas felt the river rise in his blood. The narrator set night over the city as proclamations hammered doors. King Aldric Rowan said, "Curfew until the ring is found." His words carried like iron in water. Thomas Hale said, "Curfews breed shadows with teeth." Marcus Vale said, "Shadows bite only the guilty." Patrols split streets into cages. Lily Hart smuggled bread to a widow and slipped past a helm turned by thunder. Selene Ward said, "Your curfew hides couriers better than alleys do." Edwin Cross paced the wall and counted torches that blinked in code. Thomas said, "Blink 3, pause, blink 1. Edwin said, "North Tower answers." The code crawled like frost. Aldric stood alone at a window that knew his weight. He said, "My past is knocking on my gates." Rain tapped back like polite murder. The narrator tightened the snare in the chapel, where they laid out proof like knives. Selene Ward said the eager guard met a buyer marked with the broken tine. Thomas Hale set the wax stamp, the ledger copy, and the cord cut clean. Edwin Cross said, "This array accuses half the court by rumor." Lily Hart said, "Rumor followed our steps, not the other way." The door sighed and King Aldric Rowan entered with a look that had outlived battles. Aldric said, "If the ring is mine, then the hand behind it is also mine once." Silence chipped at stone. Thomas said, "Name the winter you spoke of." Marcus Vale appeared from a side pew and breathed a careful breath. Marcus said, "Confession sours strategy." Aldric said, "Strategy already tastes of ash." Outside, the bell struck thrice and stopped on a note that promised dawn without peace. The narrator fixed our eyes on the chapel table as dawn pushed blue through glass. King Aldric Rowan said, "There was a winter when hunger crowned me before priests did." Thomas Hale said, "Say the name that winter carved." Aldric's hand shook over the cut cord. Selene Ward said, "Speak it clean or it will own us." Lily Hart stood very still with lips pressed pale. Edwin Cross said, "The hall waits for order, not ghosts." Aldric said, "I rode with raiders once and wore a stolen ring." The words struck like iron on ice. Thomas said, "Then the ring's return drags back the rider." Marcus Vale stepped from the shadowed pew and smiled carefully. Marcus said, "Confession is a door, Majesty, and markets love open doors." Lily whispered, "If truth walks in, lock it with us." The narrator moved them to the royal vault where dust slept on iron boxes. Selene Ward said, "The genealogy lies where no scribe erases." Thomas Hale pried a lid and found a lace of seals gone brittle. Lily Hart said, "Why would a servant's name curl into a king's tree?" Aldric Rowan said, "Because a child was hidden where a crown could not follow." The hinges complained like old men. Edwin Cross read a line that shook the light. Edwin said, "The mother named the child for a heart." Marcus Vale said, "Courts breed cousins faster than lies." Thomas said, "This name is not a cousin." He set Lily's pendant against the seal, and the stag's tine matched like a wound. The narrator let silence measure the vault before Selene spoke. Selene Ward said, "I have kept Lily in shadows since the winter raid." Thomas Hale said, "You knew, and said nothing." Selene said, "I traded my name for her breath." Lily Hart said, "You watched me through shutters and called it safety." Aldric Rowan closed his eyes the way soldiers close them for pain. Aldric said, "If she is mine, I made her an orphan long before she was born." Edwin Cross said, "Blood will drown us if we spill it in court." Marcus Vale said, "Or lift us if poured with ceremony." Thomas said, "Ceremony should not cut its own throat." The lantern hissed like a warning. The narrator carried them to the council where rain traced maps on the glass. "Lord Marcus Vale said, announce the heir and lance the abscess." Thomas Hale said, "You would sell a revelation by the pound." Edwin Cross placed 2 ledgers that refused to match. Edwin said, "These roots mirror the raiders and your grain tallies." Marcus laughed soft and cold. Marcus said, "A clerk's ink is not a gallows." Selene Ward said, "But coins in your man's palm are." Lily Hart stood straight, though her hands shook. Lily said, "If I am named, it will be for bread, not banners." Aldric Rowan said, "Then the name must feed before it rules." Thunder answered with blunt honesty. The narrator brought a hush as the eager guard was dragged before the throne. Edwin Cross said, "Name the hand that paid you to count us." The guard stared at the floor and waited for a signal that did not come. Lord Marcus Vale said, "This pantomime tires the hungry." Selene Ward stepped close and held up the brass stamp. Selene said, "Your wax bears a miller's grit, not the treasuries." Thomas Hale said, "Speak, or the river keeps your name." The guard looked to Edwin and flinched. Edwin whispered, "They threatened my sister and bought my silence." Aldric Rowan said, "Then the ring bought fear, not loyalty." Lily Hart said, "End the buying." Rain slowed on the panes as if the sky had heard. The narrator drew the court into a circle of steel as thunder bent the banners. Thomas Hale said, "Doors barred, witnesses plain, no masks tonight." Lord Marcus Vale said, "Then let truth show its cost with interest." King Aldric Rowan rose, and the ring lay on velvet like a thorned moon. Aldric said, "I wore this once when hunger ruled me harder than law." Selene Ward watched the guards who listened more than they breathed. Edwin Cross said, "The ledgers and the wax tie markets to your hand, my lord." Marcus smiled the way a knife reflects a hearth. Marcus said, "Commerce obeys the bold, not the timid." Lily Hart said, "Boldness without bread is theft." Rain crawled the glass like writing no clerk could erase. Thomas said, "Name the buyers at the mill and lift your cloak clean." Marcus said, "Names are coin, and I spend none for beggars." The hall leaned forward as if the stone itself wished a verdict. The narrator moved with the clash that rose like a storm inside a storm. Horns called from the north gate, and boots beat time on the tiles. Thomas Hale said, "Hold the inner stairs and breathe with the shields." Selene Ward said, "Archers on the gallery, 2 ranks, low draw." Edwin Cross said, "They carry the stag cord and show no writ." Lily Hart dragged a chest to wedge a door that forgot its hinges. Marcus Vale said, "Stand aside and spare the city a civil bruise." Aldric Rowan said, "You bought this march with counterfeit loyalty." The first raider crashed and met Thomas's shield like a slammed book. Selene slid past the blow and cut the cord from his throat. Edwin said, "Drop blades and live." The echo brought more iron than mercy. Lily whispered, "I will not be a secret while they break the doors." The narrator fixed the eye on a circle of breath and steel in the council chamber. Marcus Vale said, "Trade kept your crown when prayer failed." Thomas Hale said, "You starved villages to fill your purse and your plan." Edwin Cross set the brass stamp between them like a judge's palm. Edwin said, "Your eager man bought fear with mill grit in royal wax." Marcus smiled wider and lost warmth he never had. Marcus said, "Fear rents cheaply when kings confess old sins." Aldric Rowan said, "I confess and I answer, but not to you." Selene Ward ghosted behind Marcus and watched the window latch. Lily Hart said, "If I am to be named, it will not be by a market." The latch clicked as a rope snaked down from rain and shadow. Thomas said, "He means to run with a crown he cannot wear." Marcus said, "Crowns travel well when roads are priced." The narrator carried the weight to the throne room where thunder wrote verdicts. Aldric Rowan said, "I will face the crowd at dawn and speak the winter I hid." Marcus Vale said, "Then I will speak profit and drown you in cheers you cannot afford." Thomas Hale said, "You will stand a prisoner who taught famine how to march." Edwin Cross said, "Bring chains and witnesses who still eat." Selene Ward said, "Leave the window and choose your feet, not your rope." Lily Hart stepped forward, though her hands shook like leaves in snow. Lily said, "I will stand beside the king and feed first, then speak." Aldric's gaze broke and healed in the same breath. Aldric said, "If you are mine, I owe you bread and truth." Marcus laughed and moved for the rope like a gambler to dice. Selene's blade whispered and cut the lie from his sleeve. Rain hammered the roof like a drumline for judgment. The narrator sealed the night on the ramparts where wind shaved words to bone. Marcus' veil broke for the parapet and found Selene there first. Selene Ward said, "The drop is cheaper than trial, but it buys nothing." Thomas Hale said, "Turn and answer men you used like scales." Edwin Cross said, "Speak names and I will guard your sister from your debts." Marcus looked at Rain, then at the city he had priced by mouthfuls. Marcus Vale said, "Names are ashes once the crowd is fed." Aldric Rowan said, "Then you face the dawn empty." Lily Hart said, "And I will face it with bread." Marcus lunged and met the stone with iron and pride. Thomas pinned him, and the rope that promised escape made a noose of silence. Thunder rolled once, then left space for breath that felt like morning. The narrator set dawn over the square as rain thinned to bright needles. King Aldric Rowan faced the crowd and kept his hands open. Aldric said, "Hunger once crowned me before law did." Murmurs rose like pigeons. Lily Hart stood at his side and did not flinch. Lily said, "Bread first, truth with it." Thomas Hale watched the gates where fear had learned new roads. Thomas said, "Hold lines for food, not for chains." Edwin Cross read the ledgers and named the mills that cheated. Edwin said, "Weights will match mouths." Selene Ward mapped the rooftops with her eyes and chose calm. Selene said, "Let no man sell a rumor today." Aldric lifted the cut cord and the ring that had walked too far. Aldric said, "This returns to law, not to me." The square exhaled, and bells found a steady note. The narrator returned to the hall, where judgment smelled of wet wool and smoke. Lord Marcus Vale stood in chains and stared at the window he had priced. "Marcus Vale," said crowds, "forget the hands that fed them." Thomas Hale said, "They remember the hands that starved them more." Edwin Cross spoke of coins pressed by mill grit and fear. Edwin said, "You taught hunger to count lies." Selene Ward laid the courier's cord beside the brass stamp. Selene said, "Your road was paved with signals and shadows." Lily Hart said, "Mercy feeds, but it does not excuse theft." Aldric Rowan listened until the room stilled. Aldric said, "You serve the crown and then yourself." He named exile over scaffold to starve the legend. Marcus bowed once to pride and lost even that. The narrator walked the reopened granaries where scales clicked like small clocks. Lily Hart said, "Families first, elders next, then the line begins again." Thomas Hale said, "Guards count by breath, not coin." Edwin Cross checked measures and found them honest at last. Edwin said, "Weights hold steady." Selene Ward watched for the broken tine and saw none. Selene said, "The ring lost its buyers." A farmer pressed a crust into Lily's palm and cried without sound. Aldric Rowan arrived without escort and signed his name under a new rule. Aldric said, "This decree binds me before it binds you." Thomas looked at the city and found it breathing deeper. Thomas said, "Order that does not steal is strength." The square answered with work instead of cheers. The narrator found quiet in the chapel where storm wax had hardened like scars. King Aldric Rowan held a letter written in a hand he did not forgive. Aldric said, "A winter of theft bought a spring of crowns." He sealed the page with the ring and set it on the altar. "Lily Hart," said truth, "tastes bitter and feeds slowly." Aldric nodded and looked smaller and truer. Aldric said, "If you are mine, I owe you years I cannot pay." Lily said, "Pay the city instead." Selene Ward stood in the doorway and let them choose their distance. Thomas Hale said, "History, here's what we do next." Edwin Cross lit one candle and bowed his head. The bell tolled once, not for death, but for debt. The narrator walked the ramparts where evening smoke braided with swallows. Thomas Hale rested his axe on the parapet and let the wind dry the steel. Thomas said, "I will keep this for work, not for fear." Selene Ward said, "Then we watch from shadows that do not bite." Lily Hart carried bread wrapped in linen and smiled like a vow. Lily said, "We end today with loaves, not ledgers." Edwin Cross said, "I will count only what keeps children fed." King Aldric Rowan looked over roofs that no longer begged. Aldric said, "A crown that remembers hunger may learn justice." The sun slid behind towers and left the city outlined in honest gray. Thomas walked the wall until the drums were only rain.